Hi, folks. Denise Howell here. Coming up on This Week in Law, we've got Evan Brown, Christina Mulligan, Larry Downs, and me. We're going to discuss next week's meeting of the FCC. We're going to discuss the policy and delivery of information, communications, entertainment, and pizza. All next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twill, This Week in Law with Denise Howell and Evan Brown. Episode 258, recorded May 9, 2014. Technology Muggles. Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and I am so thrilled you're joining us today for This Week in Law because we have two out-of-the-ballpark, amazing guests joining us today to talk about some very important issues on the eve of the monthly FCC meeting next week, at which net neutrality will be front and center. Joining us today is Larry Downs. Hello, Larry.
Hi, Denise. Thanks for having me back so soon.
Wonderful to have you back. I'd have you back every week if I thought we could get you. But so, you just let us know when you have the free time. I always struggle with introducing Larry on the show. He's been on the show enough that I think people are familiar with him if you play along with us on a semi-weekly basis. I've decided, Larry, I'm just going to call you an explainer because you do that fabulously well. A bringer of clues a la the Clue Train Manifesto. Larry is, in addition to those things, a three-time author of Unleashing the Killer App, The Laws of Disruption, and most recently, Big Bang Disruption, a prolific writer at Forbes and other venues online, and many, many other internet and policy-related hats. And we're thrilled we can have you back on the show, Larry.
My pleasure.
And joining us for the first time this week is Christina Mulligan from the University of Georgia School of Law. Christina, great to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Christina teaches internet law, cybercrimes, and intellectual property at the University of Georgia. She's an expert on IP and telecommunications. So, again, we could not have picked a better time to have you on the show.
Yeah, there's so much exciting stuff going on, and I'm just thrilled to jump in and talk about it.
There is. Evan, can you believe the folks that come on the show with us? It just blows me away.
It's really something. Yeah, just as people are saying in IRC, you bring the guests, Denise. So, yeah, it's amazing some of the really smart people that we get to talk to. It really adds so much to the show, and today's going to be another one that's going to be one to really be fun to watch afterwards. So, yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, and you're, of course, Evan Brown, a partner at Info Law Group, prolific blogger and tweeter on all things internet law. So yeah. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you. Glad to be back.
All right. Well, our whole show today is going to be on policy-related issues, I would think. So let's go there first.
Always a great way to get it started with this music.
Can't beat it. All right, so next week on the 15th, barring any delays, which some of the commissioners have been hemming and hawing about, the FCC will finally present and open the comment period on its new open internet rules. There has been so much confusion about all this going back to when the news broke on April 23rd that there were going to be new open internet rules presented. The initial news reports of that said, now the 23rd, I believe, was a Wednesday, and the initial news reports from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post discussed how the new rules would be made publicly available the next day, that Thursday. I don't know if they just got that wrong or the FCC changed their mind, and I'm interested to see what our guests think about that. But nobody has yet seen these proposed new rules. The comments since have talked about them being presented on May 15th, so I guess maybe we have to wait till next week until we actually see them. Larry, you've written a big article at Forbes about the FCC's stumbles, if we can call them that, but they're probably worse than stumbles, in communications over this and other issues. What happened here, do you think?
Well, I think this was a leak that went wrong, and I suspect it was an intentional leak, although I don't have any inside information on that. But what actually happened was that on the date that you mentioned, someone identified by the Washington Post as a senior executive at the FCC leaked to Cecilia Kang at the Washington Post the news that the chairman had indeed circulated a draft of what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking to the other commissioners, and that notice would be up for a vote May 15th. And that, as you say, is what starts the comment period. No one, of course, outside the FCC has actually seen that. That's not surprising. They never would have released the NPRM before releasing the NPRM. So any reports that said that the chairman or anyone else was going to make these public before May 15th was incorrect. Now, it's likely that it's been leaked to friendly faces, although it turns out that Chairman Wheeler doesn't seem to have any friends anymore, at least not in Washington. And I've become very sympathetic to his plight here, because a lot of people making a lot of noise about something that unquestionably no one has yet seen and no one would have been expected to see until this May 15th meeting, when the process actually begins of circulating them to the public for comment, and all the filings come in before the FCC actually makes any decision about them. So people who think that May 15th is when they're going to vote, they're not. All they're voting on is whether or not to issue the notice, but they're not voting on anything related to actual passage of these rules on May 15th.
That's a really important point to make. We haven't seen the notice. They're voting on whether to make the notice public and open for comment.
That's right.
And then how long will that comment period last?
Well, usually it's a 30-day comment, and then maybe it's 45 days of comments and then 30 days of reply comments. So you can read the other people's comments and then respond to their comments. The last time we went through this exercise in 2009, 2010, with the last set of open internet rules that were struck down earlier this year in the D.C. Circuit, there were extensions for different reasons. If the government shuts down or if there's a snowstorm, that sometimes stops the clock on the notice and comment period. But generally speaking, we'll be talking about 3 months.
Okay. And again, it just seems so odd to me that, all right, we're not opening it up for public comment until May 15th. But here's an internet address where you can send us your thoughts about the net neutrality proposal that you haven't seen yet. And here is our, I don't even know what to call this thing, the public comment page at the FCC, where they have over just in the time between when I fired up Skype today and as we're speaking now, more than 1,000 comments have rolled in, 18,107 comments as we are speaking here now. This is your ability to, if you don't want to use email, they have a web form where you can present comments. And the difference there too is that all information submitted using this web form is going to be publicly available via the web. So again, any thoughts on why the FCC is getting public comment on something they haven't even approved yet?
Well, as I say, there's suspicion that the leak was intentional, that in fact, what the chairman's office maybe wanted to do was kind of let people know again that, and this is no surprise here. He said immediately after the D.C. Circuit ruling in the Verizon case, he said, okay, the ruling gives me an invitation to try again, to come up with a new set of rules that fit within the authority that Congress has granted. I accept that invitation, and we will expeditiously move to come up with a revised set of rules that will respond to the court's ruling. So we knew it was coming. I think, as I say, I think he thought he had more friends in Washington than it turns out he does. There's a old saying that a friend in power is a friend lost in Washington, and that seems to goes the other way now. If you're in power, you lose all your friends. So I think that they thought, making it known that he had very quickly come up with the new rules, he was going to act and he was going to pass them. He thought that was going to make the supporters of net neutrality happy. And instead, I think, what he discovered is that a lot of the people who claim to be supporters of the open internet really have other agendas. And they use this one in particular, they have over the last decade, as a sort of vehicle for pursuing, everything from just fundraising for advocacy groups to say, look, the internet's being destroyed, give us money so we can help preserve it on the one side. And that's both the left and the right are doing that. And then I think there's other, agendas here, people who, want to nationalize the internet, who want to turn it into a public utility. And they just sort of wait for any news hook on which to say, see, we're not getting exactly what we want. And then, start a lot of fires and raise a lot of pitchforks. And I think, as I say, the chairman's office was really surprised by the response. There's been a lot, of course, of spinning now in the last couple of weeks to try and contain the story. This is actually, as I said in the Forbes piece, that's exactly what happened almost within the first couple of weeks of the chairman's tenure with the FAA, not with the FAA, with the ruling that the FCC had determined, that cell phones were not interfering and they could be used on planes, and people took that to mean that you could start making phone calls on planes, but in fact that was never the FCC's job. That's always the FAA's job to determine. But again, it was not the PR on it was not handled very well, and it led to this huge backlash. And exactly as has happened in the last couple of weeks, the chairman's office had to issue several clarifications and blog posts, and he had to go out and make speeches, as he's been doing the last couple of weeks, to say, I'm not destroying the internet. I'm doing exactly what I said I was going to do, which was to come up with new rules that would pass muster of the courts. But I think he just ran into a hurricane that he just didn't expect.
Christina, before we get to the substance of what we think the proposed new rules will be, do you have any thoughts on these sort of communications snafus and the odd timing that we've seen unfolding over the past couple of weeks?
I mean, I think Larry has it essentially right. This is a sort of public relations debacle that was intended to go the other way. And instead, the result has been people being violently angry about the rules that they think will be proposed, whether or not those are actually the rules. So basically, this is an example of a poor way to handle a delicate public relations issue, especially when, substantively, whatever the FCC proposes is invariably going to disappoint everybody because there's both limitations on what they can do, and since they're trying to project what the problems will be in the future, the law of unintended consequences is going to mean that they're probably going to make some mistakes, and they're also going to write rules that aren't going to catch stuff that people might agree or want to have been caught in those regulations. So it's sort of a no-win situation for everybody, I think, at the end of the day.
That's kind of what happened with the 2010 rules, right? They served no particular master and got beaten up sort of across the board.
Yeah, exactly. And, the recent interconnection between Comcast and Netflix is a good illustration of that. So the general agreement is that particular agreement wouldn't have been covered by the 2010 Open Internet Order. And yet it's something that a number of net neutrality advocates would find would make them nervous or would make them uncomfortable or think maybe this shouldn't be allowed. And so, the fact is we don't know the way the market is going to develop. We don't know what's going to be good for customers and bad for customers. It depends a lot on what happens. And trying to choose what people should be allowed, what internet service providers should be allowed to do beforehand without having particular conflicts or examples in front of us is probably not going to solve those problems if and when they develop.
Evan, at least one of the FCC commissioners, and then I'm going to need Larry's help pronouncing her last name, Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel?
That's perfect. Exactly right.
Wonderful. She at least has gone on record saying, hey, whoa, May 15th is awfully soon to be putting this to a vote before the commissioners. Evan, do you agree that maybe a little more time is in order here?
It sure would seem like it. I mean, I don't have a good mastery of the nuances like Larry obviously does on this, but we already know that Commissioner Wheeler or Chairman Wheeler has already said that he wants to implement rules by the end of the year, right? Didn't I pick that up in some point? So we've got to really make sure that there is a quick schedule, quick time frame for all of this stuff. But there's a lot to happen, a lot to go on, and just to tack on what both Larry and Christina were saying, and I really appreciate the getting the insight on this about how this has sort of been a PR mistake. I wasn't picking up on that at all until I read Larry's analysis on that. It seems like the FCC should have known better than to sort of create a void here by saying, oh, there's going to be something coming out. We're not going to tell you what it is because procedurally we're just not there yet, and then give the opportunity for people to comment officially and for commentators, everybody to write blog posts and get on Twill and say whatever they want to say about it. Because net neutrality is such a polarizing issue. We've talked about this motif many times before. No matter what kind of regulation is going to be ultimately come about here, people are going to be upset about it. And leading up to that, they're going to take a very specific, a very dug-in, entrenched view about it. And there are similar comparisons to be, or there are comparisons to be made to similar situations, similar issues in other areas of law and policy. Like, for example, what if we just got the indication that a member of Congress was getting ready to introduce a bill that was geared toward addressing the issue of online piracy? Immediately, people are going to get all freaked out, thinking, "Oh, this is SOPA and PIPA redux." What if there's some, if there's indication there's going to be some kind of national treaty or international treaty about this? You see it in other areas outside of law and technology. Abortion legislation, gay rights legislation, what have you. No matter what it is, if you say that there's something coming and there's nothing substantive to grab hold onto and analyze, boy, people on both sides of the argument are really going to latch onto that and recognize that the apocalypse is inevitably here and is it upon us. So we've got to spill all this ink and put all these pixels on the screen to really ramp up our position in advance of that. So it's got to happen quick.
There's a sort of ironic note here I want to point out, which is that when the FCC says we're going to propose new regulations regarding net neutrality, the worry is that these regulations will be too weak, and then everyone freaks out as if this is going to then allow internet service providers to do something that they already aren't allowed to do. But the default right now, when the FCC is silent, is that we have an open market. There aren't any net neutrality regulations. So to the extent that the FCC's regulations are mild or silent on something, it doesn't make the world any worse. And so the fact that people freak out because they think these are going to be kind of mild or not have enough teeth is a little premature, because there's always the possibility that if some problem develops, the FCC can return to an issue where Congress can give the FCC larger authority to handle an issue that they may not have before. So really the freak out that's happening here is also just clearly unwarranted.
And also, by the way, it's not just the FCC, but the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, which have authority over antitrust and anti-competitive behavior, have always been in the background here. And many people would say, of course, the FCC has never passed net neutrality rules that have stood up to a court challenge. And yet many of the sort of worst case scenarios still haven't appeared except in tiny instances. Many people would say, well, it's not because the FCC had or didn't have rules, mostly they didn't, but also because they, the providers also know that there are existing antitrust and anti-competitive laws vigorously enforced by the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, and neither of which have been particularly shy about getting involved in the internet ecosystem more and more lately. And so even if the FCC never passes rules, it doesn't mean there aren't rules, and it doesn't mean, in particularly, there aren't rules about how you treat competitors or how you treat other businesses in different ways, in anti-competitive ways. We always have that law there, and agencies that are not shy about enforcing it.
And moreover, since the transparency provisions of the 2010 order stood, we're going to have, at least theoretically, a better perspective from which to gauge whether those things are happening.
Okay, that's great background. We know a little bit more about what we'll see on May 15th, assuming that date holds. In light of a talk that Tom Wheeler, the FCC chairman, gave to the National Cable and Telecommunications Association on April 30th. Larry, did the FCC make these remarks available right away? It seems like this might have just come out.
No, I was at the cable show, and I was there for Chairman Wheeler's speech, and the press had the remarks within 40 minutes of when he gave the talk. So those, and then he did a blog post, I think, almost immediately after. So the agency hasn't been holding back on, at least on the public comments that they've made. They've been publishing them pretty quickly.
So the blog post that came out was a little bit vague. These comments are a little bit more specific. Very lengthy.
Yeah.
Of course, we have them in our show notes at delicious.com/thisweekinlaw/258 if you want to read the whole thing. Here's a quote for you, though. The open internet rules, says Chairman Wheeler. First of all, he had this sort of funny interlude, realizing that who his audience is, the Cable and Telecommunications Association. He told everyone to put away the party hats because you folks who are not in favor of net neutrality don't have anything to celebrate about just yet. And he goes on to say the open internet rules will be tough, enforceable, and with the concurrence of my colleagues in place with dispatch. Then a little bit later, he says, since we are in Los Angeles, where he gave this address, let me use a highway traffic metaphor. Prioritizing some traffic by forcing the rest of the traffic into a congested lane won't be permitted under any proposed open internet rule. We will not allow some companies to force internet users into a slow lane so that others with special privileges can have superior service. So, we don't know what the text of the rule will say, but this sheds a little more light on how any preferential fast lane might unfold. In fact, I'm curious to see what you all think about there being a fast lane in light of this comment. I suppose a fast and a faster lane is what the commissioner is envisioning here. And my question then is, is that going to really, fast doesn't seem fast anymore, right? When there's a faster lane. So what do you think about that, Larry?
Well, so it's true. I mean, one of the points to note is that obviously in the last 10, 15 years, the overall speeds are improving, from dial-up to DSL to cable and ultimately to fiber. And then on the wireless side from 3G to 4G and ultimately to 5G. The general speed is improving, but of course, then we keep inventing applications that take advantage of those faster speeds. But what the chairman said at the speech and in the follow-up blog post, it's actually identical. There's no difference in what he's saying to what was actually in the 2010 report and order on this very point. We've had what's called quality of service applications for a long time that run over the same infrastructure as the public internet. For example, in telemedicine and other applications that require very low latency and very high availability, not PBXs, but when you have a private internet access for your company, you can buy these kind of business services already. They use the same infrastructure as the public internet, and yet, the idea is, again, as he says, you can't use that infrastructure in a way that's going to reduce the abilities of the consumers using the best efforts internet, the public internet. Again, that's what the 2010 order said as well, and it's nothing new here. That's what I think arguably that's what existing anti-competitive law would require anyway. That you can't offer, for example, to one content provider the opportunity to get faster access and not offer the same terms, the same kind of deal to a similarly situated access provider. Of course, that may make some people unhappy if their competitors are able to or willing to spend more money than they are. Then in some ways that feels uncompetitive to them. But it's really, that may be true, but it's not any different than saying if you want to buy from the post office, you want to get next day delivery and somebody else is paying for same day delivery. They're using the same infrastructure. Somebody's getting faster service, but it's not illegal.
What do you think, Christina? As time has unfolded in the brief history of the internet, our perceptions of what's fast and what's not have changed radically. So are we into dangerous ground here when we say we're not going to put anybody into a slow lane because it's hard to quantify what that is?
So I think the real potential for difficulty is going to be if ISPs that have monopolies over access to a particular group of end users elect not to create faster systems or speed up their systems because they don't need to, because there isn't the market pressure to do so from their end users. And so, as video gets more as more and more people are downloading videos constantly, the same speeds will become less effective, and there won't be, and so the regular lane, if you will effectively become a slow lane. But this is, but generally, is it a problem if someone who is sending more data wants to pay more money so that it is sent faster? That might end up being what's best for everyone in the picture. These are all really complicated relationships, and until we sort of see what happens and what the rules are, we're not going to get a good picture. We can't kind of reason from first principles very easily about what's going to be the best economic universe for everyone. In some ways, it reminds me of radio, in the sense that there's this model initially where you think of, a radio needs to pay copyright licenses to play music, but then sometimes you also have, payola. People want to pay the radio stations to play songs to be more popular. And so there's this question of who's providing value, who's supposed to pay whom, who owes something to someone else. And it's a very messy, complicated picture, and the sort of market situation and the relationships between all of the parties here, or among all of the parties here, aren't fixed. And so trying to both guess at what the rules will be and then guess at whether those rules will continue to be effective in 5 and 10 years' time is kind of an impossible task, and one that perhaps we should, kind of hesitate to do too definitively.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that both you, Christina, and Larry would prefer to see the FCC take a more hands-off approach here, because they're essentially playing with fire, and we are going to live with what they enact for a long, long time. Am I getting that right for the two of you?
Well, yes. I mean, that's been, my position all along, and frankly, it's been the FCC's position as well. You mentioned, Denise, when you were talking about this on Twit the other week, that the term for the 2010 rules that Baron Soka used was that they're prophylactic. But actually, that's not his term. That's the FCC's term. In the 2010 order, because they couldn't find literally more than one example of what the rules they were proposing having been previously violated, they used the phrase prophylactic rules. I counted it up a dozen times in the 2010 order. And in some scenarios, prophylactic regulation, prophylactic legislation is not a bad idea. But when you're talking about technologies that are changing as quickly and evolving as quickly as everything having to do with the internet, not only the access, but the content, the services, and so on is happening, I think, you can't find too many good historical examples where prophylactically regulating rapidly changing technologies has ever worked out particularly well, and in fact usually leads to really significant negative unintended consequences. That's what I've been worried about all along, and when I say all along, I mean over the last 10 years of this discussion, and I remain concerned about that now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what I think is important to really emphasize is that saying maybe we're not ready for a kind of blanket net neutrality regulation right now isn't saying that Comcast is always going to do what is in the customer's best interests, or that there aren't, potential market failures here, or potential things that as a policy matter we would want to change. But just in a rapidly changing environment technologically, it probably makes more sense to wait until we see particular harms and then make rules to solve them, as opposed to, as we seem to be doing, kind of trying to guess at what those problems are going to be and what the right set of rules might be to solve them, which is the kind of thing that regulators don't necessarily do very well. So this isn't to say that there's that Comcast and the market as it is going to be perfect. It probably won't be. Just that we're not necessarily in the best position to figure out how to solve problems that don't yet exist now.
I can think, Evan, of lots of situations where taking prophylactic steps to avoid bad consequences is a very good thing, and the case could be made for the dire consequences that might ensue here. Yes?
I imagine we could. I'd be interested in hearing some examples, because it sure does seem like that is a conversation we could have, where we could think of examples in other contexts where there's a problem that's been recognized and there's some sort of regulatory system placed on top of it, and it's hindered some or helped or whatever, depending on your perspective, done one thing or the other to shape the situation into one that's more favorable had it not been done. What do you have in mind, Denise?
Pregnancy.
Oh,
in certain circumstances.
I would love to go back. I wish there was somebody I could read the transcript of what I just said, and if I could go back and put pregnancy into my mind rather than thinking about the law or something like that. It just shows what a nerd I am.
Well, there are quantifiable differences between preventing pregnancy and trying to regulate, as Larry says, rapidly evolving network technologies. So
thanks. I was trying.
My analogy is not the best, but there certainly are situations where bad consequences are something that you might want to take steps to prevent. So I do think that, yes.
I mean, the best that I could to not have a Beavis moment when Larry was saying prophylactic. Oh my gosh, 12 times.
No, I had it for you.
Can I throw it? There's a devil's argument advocate that maybe we could make here, which is that, if we imagine that once a practice is in place, it will be harder to in a regulatory manner or statutorily change because, say Comcast gets used to having a certain way of doing things. And so if suddenly there is this sort of policy consensus or majority view that this is bad, that then there'll be more, it'll be more difficult to enact that rule because, Comcast will throw more lobbying dollars or whatnot at being like, no, don't do it. I don't entirely think that's the most likely scenario, because when there's a concrete harm that people can point to and say, this is the thing we don't like, this is the thing that's bad, this is the thing we should get rid of, it, on the one hand, maybe if one party is benefiting, they'll be more likely to advocate against it. The people that are like, no, this is bad, are going to be more wound up to advocate for passing a law that or a regulation that fixes it. So but I think that's the main reason, or that's the main worry that would speak to trying to do something now. Some idea that it would be harder to do something later, but it's not clear to me that the evidence is there to show that that's true.
Is the problem totally intractable? I mean, no matter what happens, isn't there going to be the ability for one side to argue one way and the other side to argue the other way? And here's where I'm coming from on this. I'm having a hard time. This is probably something where a greater technical understanding would help me out, but I'm really on the lookout for sophistry when it comes to how the different sides are characterizing this. There's this idea of consumer choice and priority access, the fast lane. And a lot of people will agree that that's good if you want to pay for priority access to content and data and all that, that's a good thing. And it seems like the FCC has said that the new rules may want to address that, countenance that in a certain respect. But then there's this idea of downgrading, degrading, throttling, relegating other customers to a lower set of standards when it comes to the delivery of content. Are those really just two sides of the same coin? Are they really the same thing happening in one instance, but we're just characterizing it in two different ways depending on how you come at it? I mean, is it that if one party is going to have priority access, does that necessarily mean that another party's service is going to be downgraded and relegated to 56K or something like that? And if it is just two sides of the very same coin, no matter how you look at the coin, it's going to be the same coin, heads or tails. Would that mean that there really is no solution to this? And however you characterize it, somebody's going to be able to characterize it as harm.
I think that's right. Go ahead,
what
Christine.
It might be is that there's the problem that we're worried about might be something related to network neutrality or the idea of fast and slow lanes, but not the same. In the sense that there's a worry that if we allow for people to pay for faster access, then the people who are paying for the regular access will get terrible service or not be able to reach customers effectively. And in some sense, this goes to the idea that there's going to just not be enough bandwidth available for people. And a critique of the monopoly power of the ISPs that reach end users is that they don't have the motivation to improve their services because there isn't competition. And so, this worry about network neutrality kind of collapses into, in some ways, the problem of having a monopoly in this area right now.
Yes, and
because there's not the motivation for them to improve.
So that's an interesting point. One might ask, why do cable operators have monopolies in local jurisdictions? It's not as a result of devious business practices. It's because Congress and the states, in their wisdom, decided that the best way to deploy cable technology was through the franchising of monopoly providers back in the 70s and 80s, and holding out for as much graft and corruption in many local markets as possible. Chicago didn't get cable TV until after almost every other city in the United States. Now, the Cable Act in 1993 deregulated that and said, wow, maybe it was a bad idea to have only one maximum legal provider in every local area. And since then, we've got now the Verizon and AT&T coming in as competition. Ultimately, we may see the satellite people come in. Ultimately, we may see that cellular technology is improving on a pace that it could be a viable alternative for a lot of ISP services as well. It's true. Obviously, the worst risk we've got is not having enough competition to drive the incentives for people to continue investing in better technology that will solve a lot of problems a lot faster than any legal can do. But if we've got a monopoly problem now, it's the result of earlier efforts to try and prophylactically figure out the best way to develop a market, not because of a failure of regulation, as many people suggest.
Sure. And the then question going forward is whether we're in a monopoly situation that is bad, or rather one that could be fixed with some kind of greater regulation or common carrier regulation, whether the monopoly situation we have is better than something that we can develop legally, because just because there is some anti-competitive effect doesn't necessarily mean that we can regulate it to be better. Or three, that growing access to internet through the mobile providers is going to get good enough that you're going to then return to kind of the dial-up situation where there was enough competition among people that we don't have to worry about this. So, again, this is one of those, the world in 5 years might be quite different than now situations.
So I think it was the Politico story that we have in our show notes that it was sort of trying to ballpark, okay, so we haven't seen the notice here, but let's try and, like you do with the Supreme Court, decide which way the various commissioners are going to go. Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, has put up her own blog post at the FCC saying very clearly she is not for fast lane type proposals and will reject something that includes that. She gives some history about her comments to the 2010 Open Internet Order, and she's all for maintaining the fact that we should not have preferential agreements made possible. She would have prohibited pay for priority arrangements altogether, she says. So we know how she's going to go. She's a Democratic commissioner. The two Republicans are speculated to not vote for anything that would codify net neutrality at all. So that leaves Jessica, of the unpronounceable last name, Rosenworcel, as sort of the wild card. Does that seem to jibe with your understanding, Larry?
No.
No. Okay, so enlighten us.
There's a lot of shadow theater going on here. It's very, very rare. It's happened, but it's very rare that the majority party, which is, of course, being the Obama administration, the Democrats are the majority party. They have 3 seats on the FCC. It's almost unheard of for the Democratic commissioners not to vote with the chairman, who's, of course, of the same party. So it's true, of course, Commissioner Rosenworcel did say she thought we should delay this. Commissioner Clyburn has always been vocal about her concerns about even, as you said, the last order. But it seems that could be an orchestrated kind of discussion to make it sound like, there's more debate going on than there actually is. Again, I don't have the inside knowledge that apparently some journalists have. But I would say it's almost inconceivable that either Commissioner Rosenworcel or Commissioner Clyburn will vote against the NPRM. It's not even clear that the Republican 2 commissioners would vote against the NPRM. The last time this happened, the 2 Republicans actually voted, it was a concurrence, but they voted to let the NPRM go forward. Not that it mattered because they only have 2 votes anyway, but they, voted to let it because they wanted to develop a fuller record about just how big a problem was this and what sort of need was there for regulation. So it's not even clear that the 2 Republicans would vote no here, but I would say it's very unlikely that either of the 2 Democratic commissioners would vote against Chairman Wheeler. Frankly, when that does happen, it's kind of the end. It's sort of like a vote of no confidence if you're in a parliamentary system. Obviously, the chairman doesn't literally have to resign if that happens, but it really does signal a tremendous lack of confidence by the other commissioners. And in the past, when this has happened, it's really marginalized the chairman's office to the point where it's very difficult to get any more work done. And so I would say if that happens here, again, it seems unlikely to me, but if that happens here, it would probably mean that for the rest of the Obama administration, the FCC would be pretty dysfunctional going forward. And that would be very unfortunate because of some of the other much more important issues that actually are before the commission, ironically, some of which are going to be on the May 15th agenda, along with this notice on the open internet.
Well, let's talk about that because, Larry, your article is all about how we're getting distracted by the open internet discussion and losing sight of the important spectrum issues that are also on the table. And tell us, don't they tie in? I mean, it's all part of the same discussion that if we were able to free up more spectrum, the specter of unfair competition that the open internet order is attempting to address prophylactically becomes less threatening. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. If you imagine that one of the most effective ways of combating bad behavior, unneutral behavior, is through increased competition, one of the most promising technology options for that would be intermodal competition between cable and enhanced DSL and even fiber with mobile networks, with cellular technology. Again, with LTE, the more it's deployed, the better efficiency we get and the faster speeds we get. And then ultimately 5G networks, which are already being experimented with in a lot of different areas. So in that sense, yes, I mean, if we wanted to increase competition, especially with wireless technologies, then getting the spectrum that those providers need to keep up just with current demand is very, very important. The National Broadband Plan in 2010 predicted, and there are some spectrum crisis deniers out there every time I say this who tell me that this is why would anybody listen to the FCC on this? But the National Broadband Plan predicted that if we didn't get, let's say, 300 megahertz of new spectrum available for mobile networks by 2015, which is next year, and 500 megahertz by 2020. That even for existing capacity, mobile networks would seize up, or they would start to experience considerable congestion and considerable loss of quality. That's what, Chairman Janikowski, the Wheeler's predecessor, was trying to do. Congress gave them authority to do these new auctions to try and get back some of the over-the-air TV broadcast spectrum that's not being used particularly effectively anymore, as well as some federal spectrum, which is really not being, much of it is warehoused by federal agencies. And Chairman Janikowski, to his credit, and Chairman Wheeler, to his credit, have worked very hard to do as much as they can to get more spectrum out there. But as I say in the piece, the big incentive auction rule is also on the agenda for May 15th. And there's some problems there too, but the distraction the last couple of weeks has made it very difficult even to have a conversation about how to make those auctions as possible and as optimal as they could be to get as much spectrum as possible, as quickly as possible for a new form of competition, if you will, with the cable and other wired technologies.
Christina, do you agree that the FCC should put its eyes on the spectrum prize here?
Yeah, basically. So I don't know the details of these particular proposals, but as a general matter, moving towards something more market-like in terms of spectrum allocation and letting spectrum go to its highest valued uses is definitely in everyone, including the public's, especially the public's best interest. And, the way to get ourselves out of the difficulty that we have with internet access right now is to create opportunities for there to be more competition for how end users can get internet access. And to the extent that we can make it easier and better for mobile providers to provide that competition, this is a good world for everybody.
I think we lost Evan, so Evan, if you're here, chime in. He's not, so we'll get his take in a moment here. But Larry, can you give us some examples of how this would pan out and maybe ride to the rescue of the concerns of folks like the 150 tech companies who wrote to the FCC this week, making clear that they would like to see strong rules in favor of an open internet. If we were able to have spectrum auctions that you think went off the way that they should and freed up more spectrum, how does that help? Give us some examples.
Sure. So, it helps in a couple of ways. One obviously is that it allows the mobile operators to, move more of their customers more quickly from 3G and even 2G server. There's still a lot of 2G customers out there, very inefficient use of the spectrum. The quicker we can get those off of 2G and 3G networks and onto more robust 4G networks and ultimately 5G and beyond networks, again, the quicker we'll have a real competitive alternative for high-speed access in the form of wireless. Also, a lot of the proposals have to do with freeing up, and the FCC, again, earlier this year has done a great job of moving forward on making more spectrum available for unlicensed use, particularly for next-generation Wi-Fi that can travel longer distances and therefore itself be a sort of alternative form of high-speed internet. Ironically enough here, the big investor in this has been the cable companies, which instead of building out their own competing wireless networks, as they at one point intended to do, have decided to, in fact, make all their investments in Wi-Fi. And so building out next generation hotspots and what's called gigabit Wi-Fi is sort of performing yet a kind of another form of competition to wired-based broadband. And then also, as many of the people in the chat are talking about, doing what we can to make it easier for fiber build-outs. That's not part of this spectrum proposal, but fiber, of course, is a great technology for you can do a hell of a lot with a fiber that you can't do with anything else. And of course, one of the big problems, even Google has run into this in the jurisdictions where they're trying to implement is, again, state and local regulations that make it difficult, time-consuming, expensive, and delay the ability to put in the fiber networks. Some really, kind of terrible examples of this here in California. And make that yet another alternative, and from yet another alternative provider. I think, in general, the more we can do to make it easier for these private investors to put their money into a wide range of competing technologies for broadband, that, frankly, will solve 99% of any potential problems with anti-competitive behavior before we need to get the courts and the regulators involved.
You go into the last auction in your article and how it was less an auction and more of a sale to Verizon. How did that happen, and how would you want to prevent something like that from happening again?
So it wasn't Verizon. It was Dish Network.
Dish.
So this was an odd thing, and it wasn't actually Chairman Janikowski or Chairman Wheeler. It sort of happened in between when Janikowski had left and before Wheeler was confirmed. there was an auction of a 10 megahertz block of high frequency spectrum called the H block. And it probably shouldn't have been carved out in the first place. It should have been kept with the AWS-3, which is coming up for auction next. And again, here, Commissioner Rosenworcel, sort of the maverick on the commission, she was very opposed to the carving out of this particular block. But there was a whole series of machinations by Sprint and T-Mobile suggesting, again, when you let the regulators have any power, it's going to be corrupted by the industries that they actually regulate. Sprint and T-Mobile convinced the FCC both to carve it out and then to kind of create special rules around it that were in their favor, with the promise that they would participate in the auction. Well, of course, then in the end, they didn't. They walked away, saying they didn't actually need that spectrum after all. And so in the end, the only bidder left was a Dish. And they got it for the minimum reserve price, so effectively it was a retail sale. It's $1.5 billion. It's not chump change, but many Wall Street analysts expected that particular block of spectrum could have gotten a lot more money if it was not so encumbered and it wasn't specially carved out from all the other pieces of spectrum that it was initially grouped in with. I think the lesson here, the H block mistake, is, as I say, is conditioning auctions, trying to turn them in one way or the other to favor particular bidders or to encourage particular bidders in the interest of getting more competition just doesn't work. They will outsmart and outmaneuver the FCC every time. And unfortunately, that's also what's happening to a certain extent with the incentive auctions that are going to be voted on next week.
Okay. Were you guys surprised at all about the signatories to this letter to the FCC from the tech companies? We've got Amazon, Facebook, Google, Netflix, Microsoft, all in there, Yahoo, Level 3. Some of these people are people who might want to benefit from an internet fast lane in some sense. So, Christina, what do you make of this?
I do not remember what that particular letter said, so you should go to Larry first.
Okay. And we can here before I go to Larry. I'm sure there are people listening who haven't read the letter. It's a short one.
It's a short letter. It doesn't say much of anything, but go ahead.
Yes, it states that we have heard, according to recent news reports, the Commission intends to propose rules that would enable phone and cable internet service providers to discriminate both technically and financially against internet companies and impose new tolls on them. If these reports are correct, this represents a grave threat to the internet. Instead of preventing individualized bargaining and discrimination, the Commission's rules should protect users and internet companies on both fixed and mobile platforms against blocking, discrimination, and paid prioritization, and should make the market for internet services more transparent. The rules should provide certainty to all market participants and keep the costs of regulation low. That's the gist.
Yeah. So, there's no surprise in that letter. And as you say, obviously they can't be condemning the rules that they legally at least haven't seen, but maybe they've seen them anyway. Look, the problem here is that many of the sort of types of things you're not going to see. Here's one thing I can guarantee without having seen the rules: the phrase "internet fast lane" will not appear in the NPRM or the draft rules that come across. It's going to be rules that don't enable or create anything. They're going to be rules that say what can't be done and under what conditions things can't be done. And I think the concern is over the particular wording that's been floated as possibly being a part of how that prohibition is going to be worded, that it's not going to be strong enough. So in one sense, what these companies are saying is kind of mom and apple pie. That's right. We all want an open internet. We don't want, we don't want it wrecked intentionally or unintentionally by regulation or by bad corporate behavior. But of course, it couldn't propose that the chairman do anything in particular because, again, they haven't seen the actual text of the draft rules.
And there might be a context here that they're trying to get at, which might be useful to point out to everyone, which is that, historically, there's been on the internet history of payment up to the larger ISPs. And Comcast has more recently recognizing that it has this strong market power. Not only do they charge their end users, the $60 a month to have your home connected to the internet, but they've been pushing other companies like Netflix and now kind of are trying to get the tier 1 ISPs to try to pay them to carry content down. They want to be in a situation where everybody pays them to move data back and forth. And one could see this letter from a lot of these companies as saying, like, this dynamic is not a good one and not one that we want. We don't want everybody paying Comcast. Comcast needs us too.
It's somewhat entertaining if you're following these issues to go through and read all the signatories to the letter, which include 4chan, which I'm guessing somebody encouraged them not to sign on, and something called Funeral Innovations. So lots of interests in play here. Let's see, before we leave the topic of net neutrality, because I think, what we really need to do to continue this discussion is see what is proposed next week. I just want to go around and get your final thoughts, impressions, any sort of advice you have for people as they're considering these issues. Larry?
Well, I don't know. I guess my advice for Chairman Wheeler is to rethink his public relations strategy pretty significantly. But beyond that, I don't expect that the rules as proposed will be, frankly, dramatically different than the 2010 rules that were passed. I think they will have been modified to sort of, follow the line set out by the D.C. Circuit when they rejected the last set. And by the way, that line was not very clear. The opinion is extraordinarily vague and unhelpful in many respects if it was trying to be a blueprint for what the FCC could do right. So it may be that this set of rules will be litigated as well. But I expect that, this set of rules will go through the notice and comment. They'll probably get passed, and then we'll see if, the world stops revolving.
Yeah,
Christina?
I expect whatever the FCC comes up with isn't going to stop the world one way or the other. But what's going to be entertaining is going to watch them go through another 3 years of litigation to see if those regulations can withstand judicial scrutiny. And this is, before one gets too angry at the courts, the real thing to look at is Congress and why they don't speak more clearly about whether to, open the FCC's authority to regulate in this area.
Evan, you're back with us. I know you've been off for a bit, so may have lost the thread of the discussion. But soon we will move on from this net neutrality talk. And I just wanted to see if you had any other questions for our guests or any thoughts or comments.
No, I lost connectivity because I lost power here. Usually when we're talking about network neutrality, I get throttled, by Comcast. So, no, it'll be interesting to see how it's unfolding here. Hearing all of the nuance that Larry and Christina bring to it is very helpful in recognizing, putting it in the proper perspective, because the way the FCC operates isn't always intuitive, and it's easy to sort of jump on and pile on and throw stones before it's appropriate or opportune to do so. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds.
Yeah, I do have one more question for you guys before we move on, and it's one that comes out of the fact that Chairman Wheeler keeps referencing Title II as, again, this was part of the guidance he got from the D.C. Circuit, is you could reclassify and then you would have more leeway, and he certainly is not ruling that out. And so knowing that, people ask, well, why doesn't he just go ahead and do it? And I'd love to get your take on that, both of you.
Okay, well, how many hours do we have to talk about that? So it's first of all, it's not that simple. The term reclassification is not in the statute at all. If he were to try to treat ISP, broadband internet service, as a Title II service, there would be multiple court challenges, and I would expect that actually they would lose on that. But even given that, if they were able to treat it as Title II, Title II, by the way, means not just federal, but state and local regulation as well. So we would have just a disaster if that actually happened. But even if so, there was a great Huffington Post post by Kevin Werbach and Phil Weiser, respectively, of Wharton and Colorado, saying, this is how Title II works. Discrimination, fast lanes, all that stuff is allowed, and in fact was done under Title II when the old telephone system was regulated. So it doesn't actually, if your concern is fast lanes and discriminatory behavior, Title II is not your solution. Title II, in fact, just makes that legal in an incredibly complicated form where you have to file tariffs and you have to get state governments to go along with federal governments and, rate caps, and price controls, all this other stuff that we are nearly gone with in the old phone network, having frankly killed the old phone network with them. Title II is no solution, even if it was legally allowed. And in any event, the last time this came up in 2010, a supermajority of Congress, including a vast majority of Democrats, and it was one of the few bipartisan things that ever happened, was a supermajority of Congress wrote to the FCC's former chairman and said, "Do not consider reclassification of Title II. We will look very unfavorably upon any such attempt."
Yeah. So I would classify this as there being three issues with reclassification. One is it actually a good idea in the sense that it then opens the door to significantly more regulation of the internet, or at least the ISPs that would be affected by it. Two, whether there's sort of enough corporate and political pressure to just make it not a viable choice. And three, as Larry said, this isn't just a switch that you flip. In order for the FCC to change its interpretation of its own regulations, given that it explicitly made the decision to consider internet service and information service provider, in order to reclassify it as a telecommunications carrier, they need to explicitly say, here's how we made a mistake. Here's why this is the right choice. And, just as the initial choice went through courts, this would go through a court process too, as to whether it was, presumably it would be challenged as to whether it's a reasonable interpretation of the FCC, of the animating statutes of the FCC. And so it's not an easy path either. It's not like you just say it and then there's no more court battles. Either way, we're going to, any network neutrality regulation, if there's reclassification, you'd have a big court battle. If there isn't reclassification, you're going to have a big court battle over whether the FCC has the authority to make those rules about an information service provider. So either way, it's going to be a long, hard battle unless Congress says something and speaks quite clearly.
Well, that's the big if. Do you think that could happen?
What does Congress do? Whether something is viable in Congress is so outside of kind of the technical merits of particular issues that it's always a hard call. Without there being a lot of enthusiasm in the public, I don't think Congress is going to say something. You need loud speaking, you need hot issues, you need something dramatically taking up the airwaves, quite probably, if something like that is going to happen. And that's a shame because, we would rather a world where Congress addresses the important problems of the day because they're important and not because, something dramatic has happened that has made the 24/7 news cycles get really excited about it for a semi-arbitrary reason.
I don't know. Maybe it's just the bubble I live in, but I think the public is kind of more informed than I would think about this issue. People who know I'm involved in technology law, friends who are not, rank and file members of the public have been asking me about this issue, so I know it's on their minds. And it seems like, the news coverage on it, while it hasn't been of Donald Sterling proportions, has been, up there as far as a second worst communications debacle of the last couple of weeks, maybe. Evan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly gets some mainstream treatment, and you do hear about it, and it is important because it goes to the real heart of the essence of the platform. I think that's one reason why it lends itself naturally to being concerned about. And then there are issues of there are broader issues of democracy and fundamental fairness when it comes to all this. And then because of that, it's easy to characterize it one way or the other, going back to the same theme that I've been sort of repeating both on this episode and before. It's such a polarizing issue because it strikes at those things. And that's likely one of the reasons why it gets the attention in mainstream media and it gets the rank and file attention that it does, because it can be characterized as really determining the future of what the online experience will be like and the entertainment and communications experience that we'll enjoy in the future.
Yeah.
In some ways, Congress is, damned if it is and damned if it doesn't, because these are far too technical issues for Congress to want to get at the nuances directly. And so what would probably happen is they would be giving the FCC greater authority to do something. And that opens you up for a huge amount of criticism, because the FCC, on the one hand, is often criticized for being captured by industry. And on the other hand, they would be saying, oh, no, don't regulate the internet. So there's, the safe thing often for Congress to do is nothing, because then you're not as open to criticism over botching an issue, which is, not necessarily ideal.
Well, didn't Congress put us in this pickle to begin with? How do we have the Title I, Title II distinction? Where does that derive from?
Well, initially or explicitly, it comes from the 1996 Communications Act, but it actually followed from several earlier decisions and consent decrees having to do with the breakup of AT&T and earlier rules that prohibited phone companies from doing data services and from computer companies from doing or anybody from doing phone services other than the regulated former monopoly. And that's, that essentially is what got embodied into the 96 Act as Title I, which is the data services, and Title II, which is traditional switch telephone network voice services. Of course, this was 1996. Obviously, we had a commercial internet then, but Congress clearly couldn't have predicted, nobody could have predicted that it would become the vibrant economic driver and ecosystem that it's become. So we can't entirely blame Congress for getting it wrong, even if they did get it wrong in 1996. There is, by the way, ongoing discussion about an overhaul or reform or rewrite of the 96 Act to bring it into 21st century terms. And that process, if it does go anywhere, will take years, but it is at least a discussion that's happening, and there have been hearings in Congress already about it.
Lesson from the... Oh, sorry, Denise.
No, go ahead.
Maybe the lesson from the Telecom Act of 1996 is to see the dangers in legislating and regulating in areas where technological change happens very quickly, right? Because it's not that the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was necessarily a bad law at the time, but that since the internet has changed so much since that time period, it no longer, this distinction between an information service provider and a telecommunications carrier doesn't necessarily fit with the world that we currently live in. And if you look at the definitions of those two kinds of entities, to be fair to the FCC, internet service providers could arguably fit into either one based on just the text of the statute by itself. So, maybe the lesson here is that even when you write something that might be appropriate at the time, the world can change so quickly that it might not be a good law later on for reasons that you couldn't anticipate when you wrote it.
Right, and that's why I think it might be ripe for Congress to revisit. I have a really hard time, as you were saying, making the distinction between an information service provider and a common carrier, and thinking that distinction is meaningful in the way that maybe it was in the minds of the legislators when they wrote this. One last question on this. I'm sorry I keep dragging out this discussion, but it's so interesting and important, I think. We've been having this very U.S.-centric debate about all this, obviously, because it's a U.S. agency who is making some decisions here. But I'm interested to get your take on the international repercussions. Do you think that other countries will look to the U.S. to decide how they will handle this issue, Larry?
Oh, I hope not. Look, every country is different. And, of course, in much of the world, the idea of internet providing comes out of a long history of nationalized post and telephone companies. In some cases, they're still part of the government. In some cases, they're private companies which are largely or partly owned by the government. It's a very different model, frankly, than the way in which both post and telephone and ultimately internet has developed in this country. So I always find these international comparisons really not especially helpful, and also, subject to a lot of torturing of the data. But I don't expect that, the EU, for example, will take the FCC's latest draft of open internet rules and use those as a starting point for whatever they're going to do next. It's so tied in with the history of how technologies have been regulated or not in this country or in other countries, and the geography of the United States, and the population density of the United States, and the income disparity in the United States. So many things have to do with how our communications infrastructure has been built and exists that are specific, I think, to the U.S. in many ways. I don't think it's particularly useful to compare it, and I wouldn't encourage another country to do so.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be such differences between, whether ISPs in different countries are public or private, what the antitrust laws look like in those countries, what those particular ISPs are doing that may or may not be good for customers, et cetera. So it's going to be, this is an issue that lays on top of a lot of other law and facts. And whether, different policies are going to be good depends on what those other law and facts are in different countries.
All right, I think that's going to have to be it on net neutrality for the day. And we could go on, though, to the hearing on related issues, at least related in a lot of people's minds, the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger. There was a hearing yesterday at which lawmakers did not seem to feel, via their questions, that this proposed merger was going to do anything to help consumers. Now, I don't know that that's why companies merge necessarily, although Comcast and Time Warner have certainly been singing that song to their customers. As a Time Warner Cable customer, I can attest to the PR that I've been getting from that company about the merger. And according to them, it's going to be very rosy for us after the merger. The Congress people weren't buying this. Does that mean anything one way or the other, Larry?
No.
Yeah.
Congress doesn't have any authority here over approval or not approval of mergers. Again, these hearings are partly part of the shadow theater that goes on here. It's partly part of the backroom compromises that are going to be made, the conditions that are going to be attached to the merger. These hearings are all a piece of that, as well as presumably meetings with the Department of Justice and the FCC that goes on as well. So I don't, I listened to as much as I could of the hearing this week on the merger. Really, kind of a lot of posturing, a lot of apple pie stuff being said, but I didn't hear anything substantive either from the witnesses or from the Congress people who were asking the questions.
All right, Christina, do you think this merger is going forward?
My guess is that it's likely, because I'm gathering, though I'm not absolutely sure about this, that the sense is that it's not going to create harm to customers in an anti-competitive way, because they don't share a lot of, there's not a lot of competition between them in a lot of places between Time Warner and Comcast. But that's something that I could be wrong about.
No, in fact, there's none. There's again, because of what I said before about this brilliant decision to give franchise monopolies to the cable industry when it was first being built out. There's literally no overlap in customers between Time Warner Cable and Comcast. So from an antitrust standpoint, it's extremely hard to make the case, at least as it applies to TV access, that there's any kind of competition harm that antitrust law recognizes anyway.
Evan, any thoughts on Time Warner, Comcast?
Well, I've never been too worried about it in any event. Soon after the news was announced, we had Professor Waller on Twill, and also Ryan Radia. So we had a pretty exhaustive conversation about it very early on, and they sort of set my mind at ease for a number of reasons. And moreover, if Larry Downs writes an article talking about how the case against it is evaporating, then who am I to sit here and to suggest that there will be too many problems with it? And it looks like the very opposition of it is starting to fold as well, right, Larry? Wasn't it who was it that just came out recently in support of the merger? Well, was it the Washington Post itself? So all indications are the people who are thinking about these things aren't too concerned about them. So neither will I be.
Now, what happened to the Evan Brown who used to disagree with everything I said? I liked him much better.
Well, I mean, with this one, I mean, at the risk of being too repetitive, the big thing for me, the big factor is the fact that there really isn't going to be any anti-competitive effect because of the lack of overlap in customers already. I mean, this is just there's no marketplace effect like that's going to take place, right? I mean, isn't that what you were just talking about? That really is the definitive thing for me.
Yeah, that's right. Not in cable, not in the TV service anyway. I think it's a more interesting discussion about broadband access for broadband ISP service. But yeah, as far as cable TV, this is a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a difference between what's anti-competitive under the antitrust laws and what's good for consumers across the board. I don't know if people necessarily acknowledge that there's a difference, but I think there is. And the Congress people seemed to be more concerned with the latter. They were very focused on pricing and whether this would lower pricing. And the cable representatives who they questioned said, no, probably not. Don't see how that can happen. Our services are expensive to provide, and we have to pay all this money to the content companies. So, nope, probably not going to lower pricing. And one congressman, at least Republican Blake Farenthold, you have to say that name carefully, had the concern that the combined company will serve 91% of Hispanic households in the U.S., and was asking for assurances that it wouldn't discriminate against non-Comcast NBC Universal programming. Yeah. So, again, I don't know that any of that would be the concern of the Justice Department sufficient to block this merger.
Right. So it was certainly, I mean, obviously the real merger that was interesting from the standpoint of antitrust law was the earlier one of Comcast and NBC Universal. And there, I think, you could have made a stronger case that there was, concerns with having both the content provider and the access provider being merged together. The Justice Department was very concerned about it. There's no question about it. And there was, I think, about 100 pages of conditions attached to that merger when it was approved, and many of them having to do with minority channels, with access to specific, in fact, very specific channels, and not being able to restrict those in very specific ways. Those conditions will now actually attached to, in effect, will be extended to the Time Warner cable as if they were now part of Time Warner Cable, because once those customers become part of Comcast, the same conditions will attach to that part of the business, the new business that attached when they merged with NBC Universal in the first place.
Do you think pricing is a relevant question for the Congress people to be asking about here, Christina? If we do have this one mega cable company, regardless of what their content prices are, there is the danger that they're going to be setting prices competitively too high.
Yeah, so the fact that Time Warner and Comcast right now don't compete for customers doesn't indicate that this is going to create greater monopoly power on the part of the merged Comcast Time Warner, such that they'd be able to charge more to their end users than they would otherwise. But the fact that, the question of whether things would be from different providers would be streamed at different rates if they were merged illustrates the amount of conflation that has been going on between whenever issues involving the cable companies come up. And it seems like there's just a general fear or sense that there's monopoly power being wielded unfairly, and that whatever they're trying to do is probably suspicious and bad for people, which may be true. But what's important is to, focus on, what is the actual harm that exists or that we should be worried about, and what is the sort of narrow and appropriate legal response to that particular harm. And trying to kind of throw all these things together isn't necessarily going to create the right outcomes. Is it appropriate for Congress to be worried about the cost of cable? In some sense, yes. In another sense, no. If there isn't an antitrust issue in play, if there's not a legal question at issue, then, that's the market going. And if it's determined that, because there's an unfair monopoly power that causes the prices to be too high, and it doesn't look like there's, other competitors emerging, through mobile networks or satellite internet or whatever, that may mean that down the road it would be appropriate to regulate those entities in a greater, more direct way. But it doesn't look like we're there yet, and trying to indirectly get at it by kind of these half measures or vague worries is probably not the most effective way to get a good ecosystem in this area.
On the topic of raising prices, Larry, I know in the piece that you wrote recently on CNET, you put in some interesting facts about why cable prices have risen, and one of the things that you said was the price of content is largely responsible for this. Something like there's studies that say that $5 of every cable bill goes just to ESPN. I mean, that fact caught me by surprise and seems pretty provocative, and I'm wondering whether and to what extent that should frame our thinking in general terms about things like the merger between Comcast and Time Warner. That seems pretty significant, right?
It does to me. I think the problem is that, and here though we'll sort of tar the entire industry with the same brush. All of these agreements about content are secret and under non-disclosure. So Comcast can't reveal what it actually does pay Disney for all of the programs. Comcast can't reveal what channels that have to be taken along with the channels they want, the channels they don't want that they're forced to take. There's a lot of wheeling and dealing that goes on between the big, and I'm largely here talking about the big content providers, people like Disney, and the cable operators, and we don't know what any of it is. That's, I think, doesn't really worry me as a consumer so much, but I think if I was the regulator trying to figure out what's causing a price increase and whether it's anti-competitive or not, obviously if there really was significant concern and there was antitrust litigation, let's say, brought by the Department of Justice, well, then of course through discovery and under seal, they could actually find out, what is going on here. But yeah, the sort of outside studies that try to figure it out without actually access to the agreements suggest that the very largest significant increase in cable bills over the last 10 years by something like 50% of that increase rests with improved leverage and therefore increased pricing by the content providers themselves, which kind of suggests why I'm not especially concerned with this merger. Is what I see happening in the content business is that the content providers have more leverage, not less leverage. And one of the things I think that's driving Comcast to merge with Time Warner Cable is the realization that they're on the losing end increasingly in these negotiations and are trying to, in some ways, kind of shore up their flank. Especially when you bring in, new forms of competition like over-the-top things like, Hulu and Netflix and YouTube, and alternate ways of getting the content outside of the traditional cable market. I see their business as being under significant threat, not in a bad way, but in sort of in an innovative way. And
Right.
Everyone's kind of just trying to figure out, all right, what's the next iteration of the TV business, if what do you want to call it that anymore?
Larry, do you know what the status is of Senator McCain's bill that would have allowed unbundling of some of these services or would have prompted unbundling for consumers?
Yeah, it never left committee, or it has not even left committee yet.
Yeah. So, to the extent that content is so expensive and that consumers are underwriting their fellow consumers' content because they cannot pay for just exactly what it is they want. Do you think that's something Congress should get involved in?
Well, I think it would be if there weren't alternatives. But as we're seeing, the incidence or the rise of cord cutting, especially among people under the age of 30, who either never had the cable subscription in the first place, or who got rid of it because they realized they can kind of piece together their own preferred set of channels or their preferred set of content from Apple, iTunes, Amazon, Netflix, and so on. That's increasing at from a cable company standpoint, they would say at an alarming rate. From our standpoint as consumer, we'd say, look, we have alternatives and people are using them. So if those alternatives weren't there, then it would be something I think more concerning. But the sort of bundling model seems to be on the ropes, if nothing, and maybe that's a slight exaggeration. So the need to force it to change doesn't seem to make much sense when it's clearly changing already from these alternative mechanisms.
Yeah, you either have the person who forgoes the cable company altogether and figures out another way to get more specific content, or you have the other end of the spectrum, the person who has the cable subscription, the Dish subscription, the Apple TV, the Amazon Instant, the Netflix, because they want to have all their options open. And I'm sure that all of those companies just love having all the additional revenue that these choices make available. I don't have a question based on that. I was just making an observation.
Sounds like a win-win for someone.
Yeah, for someone, exactly. So, Larry, that sounds like a good lead-in to having you give us the state of the Uber at current time that we generally go over with you, the state of upstart companies like Uber and others, Airbnb, TaskRabbit are some that you mentioned in your New York Times op-ed. These are all companies that we want to see thrive, that you see running into local regulatory issues that protect the incumbent industries, correct?
That's right. Yeah, so go ahead.
I'm wondering if we can draw a parallel here, not to drag us back into net neutrality, but do you see a similar sort of danger here?
Of course.
Yes.
Yes, I do. I think it's the danger of what happens when you take an industry that is difficult for consumers to work with, and you decide that the solution is to essentially turn it into a public utility, a highly regulated industry. That may be necessary as kind of a last measure in certain situations. And you could say the hotel industry, the taxi cab industry, to pick two, in an earlier era, that was really the only way to control them, given the sort of difference of availability of information between individual consumers and the industry as a whole. But the problem is, the downside of any sort of public utility or any kind of highly regulated industry is you immediately take away any incentive to innovate with new technologies, with new services, whatever it is, because again, the supply is artificially limited, the price is set by the regulator, changes have to be approved over a long and drawn-out process, and this is the case here, for example, for electricity and the water utilities. And the net result of that is that you have very low investment and very low incentive to invest in any kind of innovation. So that's, I think, what's happening here is now we've got, because of the mobile revolution, because of the smartphone revolution, just because of the way the internet works, we've got the opportunity to kind of radically restructure these kinds of services like taxi cabs and airports and just anything having to do with very expensive assets that are mostly unused most of the time. That's kind of the thing that I think binds all these different startups together. They're figuring out that they can innovate with technology because it's gotten faster and cheaper and better and smaller and all the great things that have come with computers. And if you're in the incumbent and you're highly regulated, for one thing, many times you can't directly compete because, again, you'd have to get permission from the regulator to do a lot of the things that the startups are doing. But more to the point, you've had several generations of managers who don't even know what the word innovation means. And so all they know how to do is to interact with the regulators. And not surprisingly, what they're doing is going to the public utility commissions and the taxi cab commissions and the city councils and saying, we've been playing by the rules. We don't think they're technically good rules anymore, and you don't think they're good rules anymore, but those are the rules. And until you change the rules, we don't see why we have to now suddenly compete with people who don't play by the rules. And so rather than trying to innovate themselves, they're fighting them in the courts. Of course, the startups are often surprised by this. We're not used to that happening here in Silicon Valley. We think we can just start whatever we want and not have to think about getting permission first. But that's what these particular startups are running up against. And it's going to be a long and complicated battle with a lot of strange bedfellows involved.
So what's the score now as far as where Uber can do business and where it can't?
Well, I don't have a full scorecard. I was just in Miami earlier this week, and they've lost there. They absolutely cannot operate any of their services in Miami. Obviously, they've had some big victories in California and Washington, D.C. in particular. They've had some big losses, particularly in Europe where they're fighting, and then a kind of lot of too close to call. They're trying to get in, for example, to New Orleans and Las Vegas and Miami, so far without any success. It's depressing. Honestly, Denise, it's depressing to think, again, from the startup standpoint, that your main investment turns out has to be, sorry, Evan, sorry, Denise, sorry, me, sorry, everybody. But the main investment has to be lawyers. That's pretty depressing.
I mean, there's so many industries where protectionism has motivated regulations sort of under the guise of health and safety. And, this is just one of them. And I think Uber is such a great example to highlight the fact that there's a ton of industries where people need licenses or to, meet certain criteria in order to operate at all. And that's really inhibiting innovation. I think actually the thing that proves how little this is needed is actually the times that Uber has messed up. When in the past, there have been the controversies about Uber charging too high rates when there was a lot of demand for their cars. You see the good market effects that happen when there's competition at play. Uber says, "Oh, we're sorry. This is what we're going to do in the future." If people continue to not like what they're doing, they switch back to using regular taxis. This is the market working correctly. It's not that if there's no regulation or if Uber's allowed to function in certain cities that nothing will ever go wrong ever. And the test for whether something should be highly regulated shouldn't be whether something will ever go wrong ever, but whether the market system, the free market system, is going to deal with those mistakes well or not. And as we see Uber being able to very kind of lively work and alter themselves when something comes up, we see evidence that their role in the marketplace is a good one because they can roll with those problems and fix them.
So I think we'll go ahead and make State of the Uber our first MCLE passphrase for this episode of This Week in Law. Some of you out there like to listen to the show for continuing legal or other professional education credit in your jurisdiction. We love that. We think we discuss a lot of things that are educational and worthy of that goal. So go ahead and take your shot at that. We've got a wiki page over at wiki.twit.tv. If you're a lawyer, it should help you out with the various processes in your state for claiming credit for listening to This Week in Law. We drop these phrases in case in your jurisdiction someone wants to see some kind of proof that you listened. And I can't tell you how funny it was last week, Evan, when you weren't on the show, but Bruce Schneier was, when we were going through this process. And Bruce's reaction was, "Really? This is how you're demonstrating that people listen to the show? You're putting secret words in. Okay." Right. In the absence of a more Schneier-worthy verification method, this is what we do. We think it's good enough, and I think a lot of jurisdictions do too. That's why we do it. Our first one is State of the Uber, and where was I going to go with this? Oh, I did want to mention too, I have an inquiry I need to respond to from someone out there who wanted a participatory credit form from us. We will give you those if you email in for them, but bear in mind, I have no staff. I'm writing those up myself. I'm happy to do it, but I'm not sure, that all jurisdictions require them. I think some people listen to the show for self-study, but if you need one, go ahead. We're thrilled that that's how you're enjoying the show, and I will do my best to get one off to you. It just may not be, instantaneous. So let's go on here. As long as we're talking about innovative technologies, one technology that people very much want to innovate with is private commercial drones. Of course, the FAA has a ban on that until, when is it? Next year, I think? At least next year.
Sounds right.
But news organizations actually are characterizing the ban on drones as a free speech issue, which I think is kind of interesting. They're thinking about the drones as a innovative way to gather news, as opposed to the helicopter flying over. You could have a drone, which would go more places and be less intrusive, et cetera, et cetera. So, what do you think about this argument, Evan?
Well, you can see where the press is coming from on this. It's clearly they want to have the and here we are again, painting with broad brushstrokes, perhaps tarring an entire sector of the universe here. But you can see, it's good that the press is watching out for the being on guard for any shrinking of First Amendment rights, infringement upon that, or any kind of regulation that stands in the way of unfettered access to investigative sources, what have you. But you can see pretty clearly the other side of the interest here. There could be big privacy concerns, and ultimately what has to happen here is that there has to be some sort of licensed regulatory scheme that is put in place here to make sure that this is done appropriately. And I guess it falls on the FAA to do that, because for example, I don't want I don't want the local newspaper to have a drone and flying it up, appearing in my window. For example, that's a pretty obvious example of things that I would want to be unlawful, and I think clearly should be unlawful because of the privacy, let alone the fact that the drone, of course, could crash and hurt children playing outside my house and all that stuff. So it's pretty. You can use some pretty banal examples to show why there are two sides to this issue as well. Clearly, drones could be a very effective news gathering device going into areas where it may be unsafe to send a human being more places at one time than what staff actually could to do things. So there's certainly positives to it, but there has to be a balance here struck somewhere. And we don't want there to be there's plenty of Supreme Court case law that says you don't want for there to be a First Amendment violation even for a moment. So with that spirit, we want to minimize the lag time it takes here to actually get a system in place where the press can use drones in a way that's going to take into consideration the safety, the privacy, and the First Amendment issues.
Is there a parallel here, Larry, to we were just talking about Uber? Obviously, there are safety concerns there that result in the web of local regulations and things that we have around taxi cabs. Is the FAA right to be cautious in its authorizing these?
Sure. So first of all, I think I should say, there are many Twill viewers who would very much like to see a camera pointed at Evan Brown's window. From the comments that I've seen about him in the chat. So
it would be so exciting.
The will of the people, the will of the people may prevail on this one, Evan. Look, the problem here, as you said at the outset, Denise, is it's not so much what to regulate as the sort of the speed of regulation. And this is another. I sound like a broken record myself. This is another example of innovative technologies get ahead of governments, and they get faster all the time. So these kinds of breakdowns are more likely. Congress ordered the FAA now 2 years ago to develop rules, whatever the rules were going to be, just to develop some rules about unmanned aircraft, or the drone aircraft. The FAA is very slow, and we don't know when they're going to finish. They've only just started circulating the drafts, I think, about 6 months ago. So in the interim, what they did was they said any commercial use of drone aircraft is prohibited until we get these rules written. And of course, now the fight is going to be, until the rules come into effect, is what does it mean to be commercial? So if I'm doing it, for fun or as a hobbyist, is that commercial? If the press is doing it to gather news under the First Amendment, is that commercial? That's what the fight is going to wind up being. But the real issue is we just can't, we can't come up with regulations for new technologies as fast as the new technologies arrive.
So there's a
Christina,
lot also go
ahead.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I want my pizza delivered, as economically and as efficiently as possible. And if that means drones, then have at it. Just like I want, my internet to be delivered at consistently fast speeds. So do you think that the FAA is going to respond to that kind of concern?
Hopefully, Margot Kaminsky, who I know you had on the show before, has a great piece called Drone Federalism in the California Law Review's online supplement. And, her argument is that, for the same airspace that model airplanes have usually flown into, that airspace should be basically controlled by local legislation. And that this makes sense because there's, a huge tension between journalistic interests and privacy law. We want drones to be able to film, forest fires and to be able to look at things that are, like crowds and even sports games and whatnot from above. But we don't want people looking in windows. And so, the way to draw the lines between what drones are and aren't allowed to do and what they are and aren't allowed to film is going to be tricky. And this is, because these sort of lower than 400 feet areas are particular to particular places, or limited in the damage they can do to particular places to some degree. This is the perfect area to have that kind of experimentalism that we often think is a good effect of federalism. So the FAA should really kind of back away here. And if you look at what the regulations, how they've been interpreted before, it seems that the FAA has kind of been overstepping by saying using a drone for commercial purposes isn't allowed until we come up with other regulations, because there's nothing in their regulations that seems to differentiate between hobbyists and commercial users under using small aircraft under that 400-foot limit. That amicus brief, it's worth noting that it's a little bit of a PR piece, in my opinion. It keeps talking about First Amendment interests of journalists, and that's a very careful word choice because they're not directly implicating First Amendment rights. There's not a very, a concrete right to bring your camera anywhere necessarily. And, if we want to analogize to, say, the helicopter, assuming the FAA has the authority for drones as it does with helicopters, you could see similarly the FAA saying, listen, until we figure out what a pilot needs to know, until we figure out the dangers, no one can have a helicopter or something like that. That's the kind of, broad, non-speech focused regulation for non-speech regulating purposes that, advances genuine public interests that would withstand any kind of, court challenge from a First Amendment journalistic gathering perspective. And a lot of the cases that talk about the rights of journalists to gather information are very limited to specific circumstances where someone needs to gather information and a journalist is just a good appropriate person to do it, or cases like Barnicky versus Vopper where the information has already been gathered and the question is whether it can be disseminated, which is quite a different issue. And so in a lot of sense, this amicus brief operates in that penumbra around the idea of the free press rights. So there aren't, specific extra rights that the press has, but because we're so sensitive as a society to having a free press, even where there isn't a strictly First Amendment right in play, we tend to give the press extra permissions or have exceptions for them to go into areas where the public is otherwise not allowed, or something along those lines. So how should we go forward? Experimenting on the local and state levels probably the best way to go, because there's going to be tons of issues that develop at this intersection of data gathering and free speech and privacy on the other hand. And seeing what different states do and how it works in different situations is probably the best way that we can get at a good balance going forward.
Well, this would be a good time, I think, to delve into Parker Higgins' piece in The Guardian, because everything we've discussed today has had a common thread of how lawmakers have to grapple with technology that is not fixed, is constantly evolving, is difficult to understand, and yet what they do has long-lasting ramifications. Trevor Timm's piece is about the Supreme Court, and he wrote it in response to the two oral arguments on cell phone privacy recently, and also the Aereo case, at which the comments of the Supreme Court justices made it clear that they had some real gaps in knowledge about how certain things work. And it's not just, lack of technical knowledge, it's lack of any sort of understanding of how these widely used consumer technologies function. And so Trevor's solution, it sounds like he's very concerned that all these problems are landing at the feet of what he calls a handful of tech unsavvy judges. And he thinks that future nominees to the Supreme Court should be quizzed on their knowledge of technology at confirmation hearings, and that maybe we should employ a technologist to explain technical issues to the less technical judges. It is a big issue that the people who make the laws in this area, and even the people who talk about the laws in this area, such as us on the show, may not have the degree of technical, detailed knowledge that you really need to thoroughly understand how everything's working and thus be able to intelligently enact laws. What do you think of Trevor's proposal, Evan? Do you think that's where we need to go?
Well, probably somewhere between here and there. He makes a very good point. First of all, when I saw the headline that, it's going to be decided by people who don't use email, I thought, because they're using text messaging and Snapchat and everything so much, right? Instead of email. It looks like we're at the other direction. The really important point that I see in all this is not so much that they don't understand how the technology works, but they don't understand how people use it. And that's really the fine point on this. And we talk about you're right, Denise. This is the theme that underlies all of this. It underlies almost every conversation we have on the show here. Technology affords us with more abilities to make choices. We have more opportunities to do things every single day, and the number of opportunities we have to go out and do things is growing exponentially because of the accelerating rate of change and innovation and all those things that we enjoy. So it's not so much understanding how the signal gets from the dime-sized antenna in the array that Ariel uses to the end user's device. I mean, the knowledge of that is not necessary to make good policy, but it's understanding the norms that underlie those uses and the desires that people have based on the opportunities that they have. That's the thing that really needs to be able to shape policy makers' thinking, legislators, regulators, the courts, to take this particular example here. That's where there really needs to be a robust understanding. Whether or not they actually use email, I don't really care. I just want them to understand how people use email and how the consequences of their decisions in that realm may affect both the present time and posterity.
Right. Some of the other cases headed toward the Supreme Court that Trevor mentions are internet radio services, out-of-control software patents, whether online posts should be judged the same as traditionally protected speech, and of course the whole constitutionality of NSA surveillance bubbling up through the various district courts. So what are your thoughts, Christina? Do we need to have some sort of vetting process?
That's probably a bit much. So, in some sense, a problem with having a generalist court is that there are always specific things, whether it's the way bankruptcy work, financial institutions, how innovators design software, how different pieces of technology works, that need to be explained to a generalist judge. And this is sort of a choice we have collectively made because of on the other hand, a fear that if you get too specific, you lose the general, themes and cohesions of a legal system. If you listen to Aereo, Sotomayor and Kagan really get the technology. And the worry is that when we say, you don't really get the technology, we're not saying you don't understand how the file moves. We're saying you don't, share my values about what this technology should be doing or, what its role is in society. You're missing kind of the cultural context. And so, these justices, a lot of them do know these things. They all have clerks that are from their mid-20s to their early 30s. In terms of understanding what's technically going on, they do. But Evan has it exactly right. The question is, how do people use it? How important it is? How important is it in people's lives? And what are the kind of dangers in it, given how people use it? And so, the bigger issue is always, can I get you to share my worldview about how things ought to be? And that shouldn't be conflated with, do you technically understand what's going on?
All right. I appreciate your thoughts on that. I personally would love to see the Supreme Court justices asked questions, not just about their stand on when does life start, but their stand on Snapchat and other kinds of modern technologies in the congressional hearing process. But
well, that would require, of course, that the members of Congress themselves understood that you can't ask a question if you don't know what the answer means anyway.
That's true. Excellent point. All right. We need another MCLE passphrase for the show, so let's make it Clueless Supremes. Sorry, Supremes. I know that you know more than we're giving you credit for, just to be able to put a phrase in the show for our listeners who need that. As long as we're mentioning Aereo, I know you said you listened in on to my Twit segment a while back, Larry, and it sounds like you and I both agree that if Aereo is going to be put out of business, that should be the decision of Congress rather than the Supreme Court. Can you tell us why you think that?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, I think one of the problems with these cases that Trevor's article brings up and that we've discussed, and I think it's relevant to the Aereo case, is, the Aereo case came to the Supreme Court on very early record. So there's not a lot, often if you think back to the Betamax case as a counterexample, there was a much more complete record for the Supreme Court to look at there, and they had testimony from Mr. Rogers and all the other things, and that just wasn't there in the Aereo case just because of its procedural position. And I think, by the way, one of the likely or possible outcomes, I shouldn't say likely with the Supreme Court, but one of the possible outcomes is that they will send this back for further proceedings and to develop a more complete record rather than trying to decide on what they've got. And now I've forgotten your question.
Congress would have to step in and say, hey, we just don't, we think this is a public performance, right, or we don't approve of you putting up tiny little antennas to kind of kludge it into not being a public performance. Okay.
So that's the problem. And I learned a lot, by the way, in the last couple of months of trying to understand the Aereo case that I thought I understood, but I didn't. It's posed as a copyright question and whether or not the rebroadcast is in fact a public performance and so on. But what became clear from the oral arguments, and I think now is clearer to me, is what's really at issue here is the entire structure of how TV content broadly has been regulated. And we've had now, 40, 50 years, again, of these sort of efforts to try and either prophylactically solve problems or to solve real problems that have come up in new technology, as cable was a new technology, and then, as the internet's become a new technology and so on. And we've seen a lot of acts of Congress that have tried to kind of paste the system back together again after it's clearly been disrupted. And I think those are the chickens. I'm mixing a lot of metaphors. Those are the chickens. The chickens that are coming home to roost in the Aereo case are decisions about retransmission consent and must carry and the compulsory license and all these kind of legal fictions that Congress, in some ways, was forced to put over when the over-the-air television business was threatened by the succession of better and cheaper technologies. So I think your point and my point in that piece was, the solution here isn't deciding about copyright or even fixing copyright in this particular instance. The real solution here is for Congress to kind of sweep away a lot of now counterproductive rules and legislation that were put into place at one particular moment in history in the television industry's evolution that are now clearly doing more harm than good.
Yeah, that's something Congress needs to do more of, isn't it? That when something has become antiquated, they really need to go revisit it,
or just put sunset provisions into laws like this that are going to have a kind of significant effect on a developing industry to say, all right, we're going to take our best guess here. I think that's what Congress can do and what courts do as well. But we're going to put a 2-year or 5-year at the most kind of clock on it and say, if we don't renew this or we don't revise this, it just goes away after some period of time.
Christina, any Aereo thoughts?
Several, actually. The Aereo case has made me realize that the copyright statute, and this is actually riffing on Larry's idea that Congress should be the person to make this decision, but in a kind of different way. The copyright statute should be seen much more like the tax code than something that's trying to protect some kind of platonic ideal of fairness and what creators are owed. A lot of the debate in the case, or the thing that seemed to make the justices uncomfortable, was that Arias seemed to be kind of, exploiting a loophole, or kind of just technically walking some line where they're on one side rather than another, where the line between public and private performance seems to be, fairly arbitrary. And the reality here is that, we invented copyright, much like the tax code, actually. The idea we want a certain amount of remuneration to go to creators. And how can we do that? The copy was a good way to measure value being created for people and from the creators in the past. And then we added the public performance right, kind of when we invented player pianos and that sort of thing. But this is a very rough way to try to get at giving creators enough money for their efforts and letting the public access stuff. And we have all these exemptions, and there's fair use, and this distinction between public and private performance isn't, a kind of platonic ideal of thing where if we just think hard enough and, do good enough philosophy, we can determine whether everything is a public or a private performance. The cases about performances and whether they're public or private always seem to turn on these silly things like which person is pushing the button. And that's because it's an arbitrary line that we drew, the same way that we draw, very nuanced little lines in the tax code, putting things on one side or the other. So, everything looks like a loophole, but there's not but you have to follow the text because there's not an animating spirit. There's the goals of hundreds of people who got together to try to make the thing. And that's the same thing about the copyright statute. So the big takeaway, and I hope the Supreme Court doesn't go this way by saying, the text doesn't really say this, but it feels like Aereo is exploiting something, so we're going to rule against them. The way to go here is to say, we wrote the transmit clause in a certain way. There's only a few sane ways to interpret it. The best way to interpret it is to say that the person at home is the person completing the performance, and that performance is private because the copy that they are performing is one that can only be seen by them. That's is that somewhat arbitrary? Is that just a call that was made based on some rough idea of what the good world was? Yes. And so if that's going to be changed, it should be changed by Congress.
All right. Evan, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm with this very same sentiment here. I like, Larry, how you described copyright as a rickety edifice, with compromises and changes along the way and sort of backing into a reality that is really brought about by innovation. And I think the same could be said about other areas of the law as well. The most readily available example is the privacy laws. There have been changes to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and other privacy statutes, federal privacy statutes, through the years to sort of address changes in technology. But at the root, we've got like mid-'80s era laws when it comes to those types of things. So those have become rickety edifices as well, if anything, just sort of from rot as the technology and the means of communication and the ways of privacy being violated in an electronic age have changed. So, it's not as if Congress doesn't have anything else to do, but wouldn't it be great if they could spend some serious time visiting at a very fundamental level copyright and some of these other areas of law too that affect technology and communications like privacy.
Larry, what do you think the chances are that Congress would enact some sort of law that required the sunsetting of laws that affect rapidly changing technologies?
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to ask me. I thought you were going to ask me what the chances of them providing, realistic reform on any of these issues, including, by the way, patent reform. To talk to Christina's specialty. There are statutes that have sunset provisions in them. I don't know that there's any particular pattern that suggests when Congress does and doesn't do sunsetting. But it's an interesting idea if they sort of said, if it's technology related, that's a kind of a plus factor for sunset provision. I don't know, if there's anything like that now, but, I I mean, we're dancing around this, but of course, the likelihood that the current Congress will do anything substantive between now and the next presidential election is getting very, very small, including, unfortunately, I think, patent reform.
Yeah. But we have gone really, really long today. Otherwise, I would love to get into patent reform with Christina. Christina, we're just going to have you back on the show in a week when net neutrality is not happening the next week. And we can go into lots and lots of patent-related stuff because it is important and something that Congress is keeping its eye on, even if it might not take any meaningful action before the next presidential election. So will you promise us that we'll get to that on your next appearance on This Week in Law?
Definitely. I look forward to it.
Okay, good. Let's move on to our tip and resource of the week. Our tip has to do with Snapchat, which we always talk about as the thing, where you can have clandestine communications. Well, it turns out with its latest update that is, to the extent that was ever the case, it's less the case now because it's actually added a feature where you can tap on a message to save it or screenshot it. So much for the ephemeral nature of Snapchat. Now, there are other clients out there that are competing on that ground of privacy and disappearing messages and stuff. Molly Wood over at the Bits blog at the New York Times writes about a bunch of them, including Telegram, Cyberdust, and Confide. But Snapchat, sort of the poster child of this, seems to be backing off. So our tip is, to the extent you were ever using Snapchat hoping to have clandestine conversations or ephemeral pictures, not so much anymore. Any thoughts on this, Evan?
Well, it's a little bit surprising, isn't it? When I think of Snapchat, I think of that and what it does. Sort of like it was wasn't it the answer for safe sexting? And this sort of knocks a hole right in that.
You tell us. Was it now?
At least there's now truth in advertising with Snapchat, right? Because there were always ways that people could technologically get around the fact that the pictures were supposed to get deleted, and so now at least everybody is on notice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I've never seen Evan speechless before. That was impressive.
Just trying to do the right thing. I could say all kinds of stuff, but my mom watches the show,
Those drones outside your windows now, those photos aren't ephemeral anymore, at least not if they're using Snapchat. All right, let's move on to our resource of the week because it's a really fun one. It's a podcast that is put on by a couple of Christina's college at the University of Georgia Law School. They are Joe Miller and Christian Turner, and it's called Oral Argument. And I think we can officially say that Christina is making the tech policy law podcast circuit. And I think we can officially say that there is a circuit in light of this podcast, Oral Argument. In addition to this one, I can think of, let's see, I jotted down a couple before the show and then lost my notes. There was, here we go. No, that's not it. Hearsay Culture is one. Jerry Brido's podcast, Surprisingly Free, IP Colloquium from Doug Lichtman, and now we've got, in addition to Twill, of course, Oral Argument, which is hysterically funny. I don't know that they always focus on technology, but they seem to have a technologically oriented bent. Joe Miller is an IP professor. Christian Turner has sort of a broader field of scholarship, but they're hysterical. Correct me if I'm wrong, Christina, but it sounds like you all were just kind of sitting around a table in one of their offices. One of their dogs was running around at your feet. It went for about 2 hours, so they've got kind of a sweet spot in time like we do and just let people ramble on and are, if possible, even less focused than we are here.
That's true. So their usual episodes are about an hour, and we just kept talking. So if you want to hear me talk about network neutrality for another 2 hours, you can listen to us riff on that particular episode of the podcast. Oral Argument is really great because they're such funny guys and incredibly intelligent. So Joe Miller, as you said, does IP, Christian Turner, kind of information theory and property law, and they both have a fantastic sense of humor. So I loved doing their show almost, but not quite as much as I loved doing doing this show. And people should definitely listen in because it's really fun.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend that you go listen to Christina's episode with them. I'm only about, 3/4 of the way through it, but we kind of jumped right into the politics and what's happening next. And if you're looking for a great discussion of the history and the policy and how we got to where we are now, and a lot more on the technological underpinnings, you guys went really deep on that. And I think it was just a fantastic discussion. And again, I'm not even through with it yet. So kudos on that. And even though there were dogs running around and and there were bonobo monkeys. And
the dog is a feature, not a bug in their podcast universe.
I agree. It's often a feature in ours as well. So definitely check that out. And I'm so excited. I can officially say there's a tech law policy podcast circuit to be on. And it's good that you're on it. Evan, you need to check this one out if you haven't seen it.
I will. Yeah, it looks really intriguing. Looking forward to it.
It's really funny. I'm just glad they weren't around in 2006 or so. I think that's when we started this show, right around then, because then Leo would have been getting emails. You've got to have these guys host your tech law show. And who are these Denise and Evan people? So we're glad they're out there. Yes, where would we be? All right, this has been a really fun and informative show. Always a pleasure, Larry, to have you back with us. Thank you so much for making the trek to the studio and joining us.
My pleasure. I of course, always have more fun with you guys. By the way, I have to tell you, I was the alternative to this. I was asked to be on Glenn Beck's internet channel today, and I had to turn them down for you. And believe me, it was not a hard decision to make.
I'm so excited that we beat out Glenn Beck. I think I would have had to come over and slap you around a little bit if you'd made the other choice. So thank you for making the right choice.
You're very welcome.
Yes. Christine, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm glad we're going to have the chance to get you back on the show and talk more about patent stuff.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about patents at any time, so I'd be thrilled to come back.
Good. Anything else going on in your world that you want to let people know about, either at the law school or anything that you're writing or working on?
The thing that's been, in the minds of all IP professors for the last week has been Aspen's attempt to rent textbooks to students and claim that they weren't buying them. I don't know if anyone here heard about this, but, one of the most popular property textbooks, Duca Minier, Aspen announced that, their future editions would be only rented to students, and they would have to return them at the end of the term, and they would get, unlimited access to a digital version, which was covered by DRM and everything. And so there was a great, backlash from a number of property and IP professors saying like, hey guys, first sale, Bob's Merrill, what's good for consumers and good for the public is to, let these books actually be bought and sold and resold instead of having people return them and then presumably have them be destroyed. And so in a matter of days, Aspen backpedaled on this because so many professors were like, I'm going to switch textbooks. And so that's what's been kind of hot in my universe this week. And it's been really exciting and really cool to see the problem emerge and disappear quite quickly. So, this is actually, it's a property question, but it's all this IP and tech stuff kind of then re-importing itself back into traditional property law. We talk about whether, software licenses and IP licenses for digital copies should be enforced and to what degree. And then we see people in the traditional property universe saying, hey, that gives us more control. That's a good idea. Let's try that. And so I've been really proud of, my colleagues in the academic universe altering that situation.
Yeah, that dovetails real well with our recent discussion with Kyle Courtney and these kinds of concerns when it comes to libraries. So that's very cool. I'm going to look into that in more depth. Folks, we are so glad that you could join us today. We do this show every Friday at 11 o'clock Pacific time, 1800 UTC. We hope you'll join us live because it's really fun to have a live audience in our chat room, which you can get to at irc.twit.tv. But don't worry if you can't. We're also on iTunes and on YouTube and on the Roku box. And YouTube makes it real easy if you have a web-enabled TV in any way to just get our content right up there. If you don't have any set-top box, that makes it easy for you to do that. What else, Evan? Anything you want to tell people?
No, it's just no. It's been a great conversation. Lots of fun today. So
Yeah, there are all kinds of ways to
get.
Yes, all kinds of ways to get in touch with us. You can go to our Facebook page, our Google Plus page. You can email us. Evan is evan@twit.tv. I'm Denise@twit.tv. Do give us a shout on the Twitter. I'm D. Howell there. Evan is Internet Cases there. Christina is CHRYSTYNA there, and she has made a New Year's resolution to tweet more, so be sure and tweet at her. And Larry Downs, of course, is Larry Downs on Twitter, and he tweets prolifically without any kind of New Year's resolution. So definitely you need to follow them as well to keep up on everything that we've been discussing here today and more. And we will see you next week on This Week in Law. Thanks so much for joining us.